Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. So in the previous series, we talked about the formation of Theravada Buddhism through the various schools in India and the establishment of Sri Lanka as the home country of Theravada Buddhism, and in particular the Mahavihara Monastery, which became the seat of orthodoxy in Theravada Buddhism, and really the origin of all the Theravada bhikkhus in the world could probably almost certainly trace their ordination through the Mahavihara. And in this presentation, I want to talk about another very important Theravada country, Burma, and the development of Buddhism in Burma over the centuries. To begin with, I'd like to just clarify a point of terminology. The official name of Burma is now Myanmar, and I'm going to basically just use Burma because it's easier, and it's a kind of the established traditional name. The name Myanmar was decided upon by one of the recent military governments, and the ostensible reason is it's more inclusive of the other ethnic groups in Burma. But this doesn't seem to really make sense because the word Myanmar is actually a literary or poetic name for the Burman people. So it doesn't seem to make sense. It's just changing one name for the same group for another. Burma is not a unified country ethnically. It's quite diverse. There are different groups there. Historically, there's been 4 groups that are of some importance. There's many other smaller groups. There's the Burman people themselves, who came to be the dominant ethnic group within that region. But there's also the Mons, who are people that no longer have an independent country, but they still exist as an ethnic group in parts of Burma and Thailand. But at one time they had a very flourishing civilization, and were probably the more in the early times they were probably the more sophisticated and advanced culture in Burma through the influence of Indian traders. They were mostly like in the southeast of the country. There's the Shan people in the northeast, who are somewhat related to the Thais. They're part of the same migration of peoples that were driven south by the Han expansion, previously living in what's now southwest China. And finally, there's the Pyu people, Pyu. This is a group that no longer exists as an independent group. They were merged in with the Burmans, but they had one of the earliest civilizations in the upper Irrawaddy Valley. So this is just the barest outline of a background to make sense of the complicated history behind Burma. When we turn to Burmese Buddhism, which is the real theme of this talk, the earliest events are the legendary visits of the Buddha to Burma. Now these can be doubted that they actually historically occurred, but they're an important part of Burmese legendary history, that the Buddha went twice to Burma. The first one involved the monk Puna, who incidentally I was originally named after. That was my name when I was a novice, was just Puna, and I think I was named after this character. He was from the from Burma, and a place called Suparanta, and he went to India and learned, studied with the Buddha, and then asked to return to his home country and spread the Dhamma there. And the Buddha first tried to discourage him and said the people of Suparanta are wild and fierce and rough. You don't want to go back there. And he said, no, I'm not afraid. Let me go. And so the Buddha let him go. And then after some time, he sent a message to the Buddha talking about how he was having some success, and the Buddha decided to visit him, and he went in like a magical caravan that Sakka, the king of the gods, created 500 magical palanquins that the Buddha and 499 Arahant bhikkhus flew through the air to Suparanta. And after he had visited with Puna and preached to the people there, on his return journey, he visited a Naga king, Namada, also in Burma, and during this visit with the Nagas, he left in the stone 2 footprints that are still apparently visible and are a place of pilgrimage in Burma. The second visit was to the king Chandra Surya, the king of Dhanawanti in Arakan, that had established a wish to go to India to visit the Buddha, and the Buddha, with his psychic power, knew that the king wanted to travel to India, but he said that the journey would be rough and dangerous, and I'll save him the trouble. And he went to, again by magical means, he went to Burma to visit this king, and after staying a while, when he was ready to leave, the king begged him to leave a relic for them to worship. So they wanted an image. So Sakka, the king of the gods, again assisted in this and made an image of the Buddha by magical means. And the Buddha breathed on it. It is said to then have transformed to look exactly like the living Buddha, so you couldn't tell the two apart. And it's called the Mahamuni image, and that image still exists in Burma, although it's been covered by quite a bit of gold foil, so that it's a bit obscured. And it's a place of reverence and great worship, and it's still one of the important pilgrimage sites in Burma. It was originally in Arakan, but in 1784, King Bodapaya conquered Arakan and transported the image to Mandalay. This is part of the centralization of the Burman state. And this was something we see a lot in the history of Southeast Asia, that when kings conquer another kingdom, they'll take the most holy relics and statues and bring them back to their capital. That's the case of the Emerald Buddha in Thailand. It was similarly moved from Laos. There's another incident that actually probably has some historical basis. In the Pali Canon, there's the story of the Buddha after he was enlightened under the Bodhi tree. The first people he met were 2 merchants, Tapusa and Balika, and they became his first disciples, and he gave them the 2 refuges. It's only 2 because the Sangha did not yet exist at that time. And they begged him for a relic, and he gave them some hairs from his head. And these merchants are said to be from Burma. They traveled back to Burma and enshrined the hair in a stupa, which is another pilgrimage place in Burma, is the Shwedagon Pagoda. The first real historical entry of the establishment of Theravada Buddhism in Burma was with Asoka's missions. King Asoka sent, after the Third Council, he sent missions to many other countries to spread the Dhamma. And one of these countries that's listed is Suwana Bhumi, which means the Golden Land, and that's thought to be somewhere on the Burmese coast. It was probably to Indian colonies in the area that they first went. There was an establishment of Indian traders and colonists on the coast of Burma in those days. So they were already culturally part of the Indian sphere. So that they were probably the first recipients of the Asoka's missions. But it's said that the missions also converted one of the local kings, and this began the establishment of Buddhism in Burma. In the another famous visit to Burma was in the 5th century A.D. Buddhaghosa, the great commentator, traveled to Burma. Some Burmese accounts claim that he was originally born in Burma, although this seems unlikely. His biography in the Sinhalese version has him coming from northern India, and he certainly seems in his writings to be more part of the Indian cultural sphere than Southeast Asian. But in any case, it's said that he visited Burma, and there's one kind of charming story about his visit, that when he first landed, a mole crawled out of the earth and felt reverence towards this holy man and offered some straw. And because of this act of merit, this mole in a future time became born as one of the great kings of Burma. So Buddhism was established in Burma from this early time, from Asoka's time, which was 220 something BC, and it spread slowly. The Pyu people in the north became very devout Buddhists, at least by the 4th century. In fact, the oldest known surviving Buddhist scriptures, physical scriptures that we have are from the Pyu region of Burma, inscribed on gold plates. There's a few sections of suttas inscribed on these gold plates that have been found by archaeologists. But Buddhism was not the only religion in Burma, and this continued for a long time, that there was Hinduism and also Mahayana Buddhism, and the native animism, which centered largely around the worship of what they called Nats, which were basically Nagas, like serpent or dragon beings. And this was a very important part of Burmese belief for a long time, even down to the present. The Burman people came in from the north towards the end of the first millennium AD, and it seems the Burmans are related to the Tibetans. They have their language has some similarities to Tibetan, and they early on followed a form of Vajrayana Buddhism that was called Ari Buddhism, that was existent in Burma for a long time, as well into early modern period. It was a form of tantric practice, and it was often denounced by the Orthodox Theravadins as being corrupt and decadent. The monks of the Ari tradition not only drank liquor, they performed animal sacrifices, and some of their rites involved sexual acts. So they were very
kind of wild backwoods tantric type practitioners, and they became for a time very powerful, became very rich, and they owned at one time they owned great tracts of land and had a great deal of economic power. In the 11th century, there was a great Burmese king, Anarata, who established the first unification of most of what's now Burma by conquering the Mon territories. And the Burmans at that time were at a lower level of civilization. They were more kind of barbarian, and the Mons had a more sophisticated civilization. So as often happens in history, when a barbarian kind of people conquer a more civilized one, they adopt the culture of their conquered people. And the Mon culture influenced the Burmans after that. So the Burmans began to adopt Theravada Buddhism, and one very important figure in this process was a monk called Shin Arahan. Shin is a title. It's like a venerable one, or Bante. Shin Arahan, who became a close confidant of he lived a very long time. He died quite old, and he was a confidant of 3 successive Burman kings, and promoted the conversion of the country to Theravada Buddhism. In 1070, the king sent some bhikkhus to Sri Lanka to reestablish the proper ordination there. This was one of several cross-cultural exchanges between Burma and Sri Lanka, which became very important in later times. This was after the period in Sri Lanka when the Cholas, the Hindu Cholas of South India, had conquered Sri Lanka and ruled it for 70 years, and the Sangha was somewhat persecuted and dispersed, and they were in need of reestablishing proper ordination lineage. So the monks came from Burma to do that. And this established a friendship between the two countries. And in return, the king of Sri Lanka sent scriptures back to Burma, the Tipitaka, so that the Burmese now had a complete Tipitaka. And part of this interchange with Sri Lanka involved the repeated several times through Burmese history a reform of the Sangha. The Burmese had sent monks to help the Sri Lankans, and sometime later the Sri Lankans returned the favor when one of the kings of Burma, Uttarawidya, decided that the Sangha had gotten corrupt and they needed to reinvigorate it. So he asked for monks to come from Sri Lanka and start a new ordination lineage and to reform the Vinaya. And this caused the first schism because some of the monks didn't want to follow the new lineage, and they stayed with the old lineage of Shin Arahan. It was a more native Burmese lineage, so that the two coexisted for some time until the older lineage died out. The civilization of Burma now in from 1100 roughly to the late 1200s was centered in the city of Pagan in the north. And this city is known for, even today, for as a tourist destination to see all the multitude of stupas that have been built there. This became a great activity, a building activity of the kings to show their faith in the Buddhist religion. They would build stupas, and there's thousands of these gold-plated stupas all around Pagan. Some authorities think that this excessive building of stupas actually ruined the Pagan economy and began the decline of that civilization, that they went to such extremes with this. Pagan was also noted for the beginnings of serious Buddhist scholarship in Burma. The Burmese from this time on put a good deal of emphasis on study, and it was a highly literate culture. The estimate is that because of the excellent monastic schools, up to 50% of the population, the male population, were literate, and maybe about 10% of the female population, which is a very high number for that compared to other countries in the world at that time. And the areas of study that they took particular interest in was, first of all, Pali grammar. There's a number of Pali grammars and dictionaries and so on that were developed at that time. And then a little bit later, they began to get into Abhidhamma studies, which became a very great specialty of Burma, the study and promulgation of Abhidhamma. Now we move forward in time. After the fall of Pagan was in 1271, when the Mongols invaded, and the whole country was. The Mongols didn't stay, but they disrupted things enough that it finished off the Pagan dominance. And for a while, the Shan people became the dominant group in Burma for the next few centuries. One of their kings, Dhamma Zedi, shortly in 1470, he reigned from 1472 to 92, and he was a Mon ruler. He did another one of these periodic reforms of Buddhism by bringing monks over from the Mahavihara, and also besides purifying the Vinaya, he also made efforts to promote the keeping of the 5 precepts by lay people, banning animal sacrifice and alcohol. And he used a method of punishing bad bhikkhus. He didn't, because the king actually did not have authority directly to punish a bhikkhu who was living outside of the Vinaya, but he could punish their families, which is what they did. If you didn't listen to the king, then your family would suffer for it. There was one Shan king who, in the 1500s, who attempted to destroy Buddhism and persecuted the Sangha and the bhikkhus, and this was a short-lived phenomena. Sangha soon recovered, and Theravada Buddhism remained the dominant religion in the country. In the 1500s, the Burmans again came to the fore, and really have remained so ever since. They established what's called the Taungoo Empire, and again there was culturally, although politically it was dominated by the Burmans, It was culturally influenced by the Mons, and there were again more contacts with Sri Lanka and the Mahavihara, and there was a concerted effort to bring the practice in terms of the doctrine and the Vinaya and the ways of behaving in line with the standards established by the Mahavihara, which throughout this whole for many centuries was regarded as the source of orthodoxy and proper practice. It was like the center of Theravada Buddhism in the world was this Mahavihara in Sri Lanka. At this time, the practice of animal sacrifice was finally wiped out. This was something that had been going on all the time, more or less behind the scenes. Even though the country was officially Buddhist, there was a lot of still pre-Buddhist influences, and the Ari bhikkhus were still around, although they were now fading, and the end of the Ari or Vajrayana bhikkhus is dated to this period. This tantric Buddhism died out at this time. But what did survive even down to the present day are what are called Weska, which is a Burmese word that's a corruption of the Pali Wijadara, which means like magic wielder or wizard. And these are men who practice various kinds of occult spells, do astrology, and they're only very tangentially related to Buddhism. They do astrology, and their belief is that if you are a perfect adept in their system, then you'll become an immortal wizard. And they still exist in Burma today, and people go to them for astrological predictions or for curings and so on. And they may be, it's possible that this Weska movement came out of the Vajrayana Ari Buddhists, but it's not certain. Under King Sane in the late 1600s to early 1700s, a controversy started that was to last 100 years. That seems like a great deal of fuss over something very small, but it really disturbed the Sangha for a long time. There was a controversy over whether it was proper to wear the robe with one shoulder bare outside the monastery. And according to the Vinaya, the bhikkhus are supposed to, while they're in the monastery, they wear the robe such that one shoulder is not covered. And when they go on alms round or they go into the village for any reason, they're supposed to fold the robes a different way and cover both shoulders. But was a group of monks who said, no, that's wrong. We're supposed to wear the robes just the one way all the time and leave the shoulder bare. And this became like a huge controversy and caused conflict and even some violence between the two groups of monks. And the kings at that time still had a lot of influence and say over Sangha affairs. And some kings favored the one-shoulder monks and some favored the two-shoulder monks, and it went back and forth. And it reminds me somewhat of, if anyone's read Jonathan Swift and the Lilliputians and the dispute between the big enders and the little enders. It's almost the same sort of thing. But this went on for like 100 years. But this wasn't the only thing that was happening at the time. There was also in the 17th century the beginning of translating Buddhist texts into Burmese language, which allowed more lay people to be able to read the scriptures, and generally only the monks would learn Pali. So we now have translations, particularly of Abhidhamma again. The Burmese always seem to be fascinated by Abhidhamma. And translations of Abhidhamma and Abhidhamma treatises and commentaries were translated into Burmese language for the first time. Then, in the late 18th century, we have the great king Bodhipaya, who finally settled the question of the robe wearing issue by calling a great council and making his decision. Okay, from now on, this is how you do it, and it was settled it the way which is actually the way according to Vinaya, that you wear the robe with one shoulder in the monastery and two shoulders without. And as part, and though this was the kind of the first business of this council that he called, but it went beyond that. He produced or instigated what are called the Sudhamma or Good Dhamma reforms to reform the Vinaya and keep everything in line. And he established it for the first time, an institution of a council of elders, senior bhikkhus, who would be the official guardians of orthodoxy and the governors of the Sangha in general, the Sudhamma Council. Then in the early 1800s, again in a relationship with Sri Lanka, they sent bhikkhus to Sri Lanka to reestablish the order there, which had diminished after a long period of political turmoil in Sri Lanka. And Sri Lanka, of course, now is under British rule. And they sent monks to Sri Lanka to reestablish an order, the Amarapura Nikaya. This is something we see in all the Theravada countries, that there are several competing ordination lineages. So in Sri Lanka, the older lineage was the Siam Nikaya that was established out of Thailand. But they, at some point, under royal pressure, they imposed a rule that commoners were not allowed to ordain, only members of the noble caste, which is contrary to the Buddhist teaching. So at this time they asked to reestablish a new lineage that would be open to everyone, which is what happened. Now the British were now becoming a dominant power in the region, and they conquered Burma in stages. In the early 19th century, they conquered part of Burma in the south and west, bordering on British India. And so this created a new situation, because there was a good region, a large region of Burma that was no longer under the control of the king or the Sudhamma Council. And this had both positive and inadvertent, or negative and inadvertently positive effects. On the negative side, it did allow a lot of laxity, and many of the bhikkhus began to fall into lax ways and loose vinaya. But on the positive side, the presence of the Sudhamma, or the dominance of the Sudhamma Council, although it had a good intention, just the bureaucratic nature of such a council controlling everything in the Sangha did not allow for new developments or creative expression by the bhikkhus in the practice. So when the power of the Sudama Council was lessened in this way, this allowed the beginning of the Vipassana movement. That there were several bhikkhus who at this time began to promote the idea that meditation, particularly Vipassana meditation, was more important than chanting or ritual or merit making. And they began to establish these monastic centers of meditation. One of the first famous teachers in this regard was a man called Madawi, who actually began even before the period of British conquest and overlapped with it. He was the first famous teacher of Vipassana, and his system was based on contemplation of the three characteristics across the five aggregates. Now we had with the British ruling part of India, the remainder of Burma was under for the last period of Burmese independence, was under the reign of King Mindon, who is remembered in Burma with great affection. He was considered, this is like the Indian summer of independent Burmese civilization. He was considered to be a great king and a very strong supporter of Theravada Buddhism. One of the actions of his reign was to hold what's called the Fifth Buddhist Council from 1868 to 1871, when he brought bhikkhus from other Buddhist countries, and they went through the whole Tipitaka to try and correct any discrepancies or errors between the recensions, because the Tipitaka by this time existed in Burmese, in Sinhalese, and Siamese alphabets, and separate traditions of copying and recension over the centuries. So it was an attempt to reconcile any small discrepancies and establish an authoritative text. He also supported the Vipassana movement, and in this time, the monk Ledi Sayadaw began his career, and he's a very important figure in the Vipassana movement. He's written numerous books. Several of his books are translated into English, and they're very technical and very heavily oriented towards Abhidhamma interpretation of mind states that are experienced in Vipassana. So we see this in Burmese Buddhism has this particular characteristic that began really in Pagan with the emphasis on Abhidhamma studies, and then in the later period with Vipassana. These two aspects go together very well, Vipassana and Abhidhamma. One is the theory and one is the practice of examining mind states in detail. That brings us pretty close to modern times, and of course the Vipassana movement in Burma continued to develop, and we have great teachers like U Ba Khin, Mahasi Sayadaw, and Goenka, who all came out of the Burmese tradition and all have some influence of Ledi Sayadaw in their lineage. He was like the great grandfather of all these traditions. And these Burmese Vipassana traditions have now spread around the world and have had influence in other Buddhist countries. Mahasi Sayadaw and Goenka particularly have been practiced in Thailand and in Sri Lanka, and also in the West. We have a lot of meditation centers that have been established in the West that are based on either Mahasi Sayadaw method or on Goenka's method. And these are all have their roots in Burma. And you can trace them back to Ledi Sayadaw. So that's a brief capitulation of Burmese Buddhism and its trials and tribulations, its connections with and interface with Sri Lanka, and its emphasis on Abhidhamma and Vipassana.